Deus, o salutaris nostre, Domine ex Deus, Filii ex Deus, Deus noster, Galilei, Domine ex este, Angeli, Arcangeli, Ave Pateti, Laudam Deum, Domino Maestatis,
Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope you're having a fantastic day. It is Friday, May 31st, and we are currently 15 days into the Leonine papacy. So I mentioned in a community post, and I also posted this on Twitter, that I was thinking about during the Leonine papacy in order to help you guys keep up on things, because I realized that there's just a lot of stuff that kind of comes out of the Vatican. And it can be very difficult to figure out what's going on, what's being said. I asked if I should do every single Friday a overview of the documents that have come out from the Vatican, from specifically Pope Leo or authoritative dicastery teachings. And a lot of you said you wanted it. So this is going to be the first installment. I know I said I'd do it every Friday. We're going to kind of see, because some people said, well, don't do it too often. Other people said, well, make sure you're thorough. Some people said, I don't have time to listen to a long one. Other people said, make sure, a lot of people had input in it. So just let me know what you think about this first one. But this first one needs to be pretty unique, because with this first one, I need to lay out a lot of the overview when it comes to different types of papal documents, different degrees of authority in papal documents, because a lot of people, there are genuine questions on this. For example, if I were to quiz you and ask you, is a papal homily magisterial? Are you required to give obsequium religiosum to a papal homily? A lot of you would not be able to answer that question. Or if I gave you a sort of question of, is every single pronouncement in a papal encyclical? Do you have to give obsequium religiosum? Do you have to have conditional assent to those things? A lot of you wouldn't be able to answer it. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to go through a lot of the different distinctions on all of the different types of documents, so you kind of know what's going on, generally speaking. So when I say this is an audience, or this is a homily, or this is an angelus message, or this is an encyclical, you kind of know what I'm getting at, right? So this first episode is going to have a lot of those clarifications as part of it. And since I have 15 days to cover when it comes to papal documents, my analysis of those documents is going to be a little bit more sparse than it normally will be. But just to clarify, because the purpose of this series in particular has to do with the teaching of Pope Leo. Because when it comes to those who are students of theology, those who are interested in Catholic action, or Catholics in general who want to be well catechized, what is important is that they need to learn from and defend the teachings, the doctrinal pronouncements specifically of the Roman Pontiff, right? So what that means is I'm going to be going over documents. I'm going to be going over teachings. Those are the type of things I'm going to be going over. I'm not going to be going over curial appointments. I'm not going to be going over Vatican rumors. I'm not going to be going over, whatever type of Roman drama that goes on. If you want to watch about that stuff, you can watch somebody else. I'm not going to analyze his episcopal appointments or his curial appointments or anything like that. Honestly, I'm not even going to find out about that. So I'm not even going to, if I wanted to, be able to give a take on any of those things, because that's just not my thing. That's just not the thing that I usually look into. So again, as a point of clarification, there's a very specific area in which this series will be covering, It will not be covering a bunch of the contemporary Vatican news drama. Don't know about any of that stuff. Don't ask me. If you ask me a question about it, I won't be able to answer you, and I'll probably just skip your question, okay? But before we continue, right, we have something that's very important. The Brief Refutation of Middle Knowledge by Bill Owart, okay? Brief Refutation of Middle Knowledge by Bill Owart. Everyone needs to pick up a copy of this off of Amazon. We're getting up there with copy sales. We're doing pretty good right now. And also write a review. I think we're at like 42 5-star reviews. A really good number would be 55 star reviews. So I need at least 8 of you guys to go and to give a review of the Bill Owart book. But go to Amazon, Brief Refutation of Middle Knowledge by Bill Owart, okay? You need to pick it up. It's a requirement, okay? Anyways, the first thing that I wanted to do going over all of this is to give you a little bit of information over how to actually find papal teachings, right? So you guys want to go and read the sources for yourself. Let's say I mention a homily or an audience or something like that, and it's in an area that you have particular interest in. How are you going to actually go and find that? Well, it's actually very easy. What you do is you go to the Vatican.va website. So you just type in Vatican.va, and it should come up, and the screen should look like this. Very easy to find. Very easy to find. And what's going to, in the news section of this, there's going to be a bunch of the last like week and a half-ish of a bunch of different documents collected together. So what you're going to want to actually do is you're going to actually want to click Daily Bulletin Press Office and then go to like the 5th month or whatever day you want to go to. And this is going to, for the whole month, or you can go to whatever year or month you want. It's going to contain everything. So you're going to want to go to the press office page, and it's going to give a summary of everything. And it's very easy to find this. So if I mention anything by name, you should be able to find it here. You just have to look at the date. So this obviously would be like May 21st right here, or May 20th up there. Okay, so that's how you find documents, right? If you want to read them for yourself, you don't want to have to go to the Vatican News website and go through all their editorializing and all of that stuff. You go to Vatican.va. It's very easy to find. Or you could literally just type it into Google. And if you get close enough with the Pope Leo XIV, then close enough with the title, and then Vatican.va, it's probably going to pop up in the Google search. It's very easy to actually read the stuff for yourself, because a lot of the times you will have certain weird misconstruals of different documents that you hear coming out from a lot of different people. When it comes to papal documents, especially audiences and homilies and things like that, they're generally very easy to read. So it's not too hard for you to actually go out there and just read stuff for yourself. So that's how you go and actually find out where to find his teaching. Now, before I get into the actual different documents, what I wanted to do is I wanted to distinguish between the types of ways in which a pope can teach, right? So first, what you need to remember, what we need to note, is there is a distinction between doctrinal and legislative documents, okay? You probably heard doctrinal and disciplinary, but really you need to think about doctrinal and legislative. So a legislative document is given to enact some sort of law. So let's say the Pope wants to change the laws surrounding the papal conclave. He would give a legislative document, right? We're not really concerned here as much with legislative documents, because this is not a show on canon law. This is not a show on the way in which legislation in the church functions. That type of information is really more of the general concern of specialists in those fields. So there's a lot of different documents that are generally speaking legislative. You're not going to really worry about most of those. Some of those are useful, but most of those you're not going to want to consider. And then on the other hand, there's doctrinal documents. So this is kind of weird for me to distinguish it like this, because there are a bunch of documents which are purely doctrinal. So like usually a papal audience, like a Wednesday catechesis or an encyclical letter or something like that. Those are usually going to be doctrinal in nature. They're meant to teach you something, right? But then when it comes to a lot of the legislative documents, especially recently, they don't just function in the sense of kind of like putting out a bunch of lists of laws like you would get in a sort of like code of canon law type fashion, where they say, okay, here are the 50 articles and blah 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 blah. Rather, there's actually there's a part of the document that is legislative in nature, so the second half of the document, and then there's a part of the document which is doctrinal in nature, so the first half of the document. So rather than distinguishing as much between legislative documents and doctrinal documents, you should distinguish between doctrinal documents and then the doctrinal and legislative aspects of a legislative document. As weird as that sounds, if you read one of them, like if you pick up a motu proprio, for example, pick up a motu proprio, you can read like Traditionis Custodes, for example, on the Latin Mass, since that's very controversial now. If you read that, you see that there are certain legislative aspects. It's saying, okay, well, here are the rules. But then you read the first half, there's actually a doctrinal aspect. Here's the teaching right there. And gives some sort of justification for the foundations of the law, right? Laws are not things like to be believed, really, like formally speaking. Laws are not things that you believe. You don't believe, for example, in, different rules around legislative procedure or something like that. That's not like an object for belief. That's an object for obedience. If they're telling you to do something, you have to obey it. But the first half, that doctrinal aspect, there we can find some sort of teaching. So it might be relevant to cover those aspects. So that's the first distinction you need to keep in mind right there. So canonical legislative documents are really not going to be of too much interest, except those sections which touch somehow on teaching. And then what you also have to remember is that these categorizations of the different types of documents, they don't necessarily, they generally frame onto, but they don't necessarily lead to a strict deduction about degrees of teaching authority, right? So to give like a weird analogy, if the Pope wanted to come out and in a papal homily give an ex cathedra statement, he could do that if he wanted to. If he meant to bind in a certain way, in a certain position, what type of document he uses is actually not really relevant to how much weight he puts behind it. So oftentimes I'll get questions like, oh, what are the relative weight of authority of an Angelus message versus a papal homily? Really, you could only speak in generalities, because it doesn't matter what type of document it is. That's not how the magisterium speaks about the weight of documents. It doesn't matter the type of document. Rather, it matters the way in which the Pope speaks in the document. So a Pope can speak merely in a way to convey some sort of pastoral guidance. Or, on the other hand, a Pope can speak in a way which is meant to determine a controversy. So if a Pope goes and attempts to determine a controversy, then that is completely different than giving merely pastoral guidance. A Pope can, in the same document, give an infallible proclamation and then also have non-infallible portions of that document where he's meant to explain them, or maybe to illustrate them, or maybe to say things, what are called obiter dictum, basically like things that are said aside. So really is not relevant which type of document. It isn't like the same way that American judicial or legislative procedure has, with like strict categorization of documents and the type of effects that take place. It's like that in canon law, but it's not like that when it comes to the doctrinal pronouncements of the Roman pontiffs. That's very important to keep in mind. So really, when we're talking about different types or degrees of or different kinds of teaching documents, this is not so much a very strict process of saying that, an encyclical is this much weight, an apostolic constitution is this much weight, motu proprio is this much weight. It doesn't really work like that, okay? It's rather than taking that type of strict reasoning, we need to take what I'm going to call moral reasoning, right? And we understand this in our day-to-day life. Like if you went to work and your boss came into, your little cubicle, because I know all you guys are cubicle people, goes in your little cubicle and he suggests something about the way in which you do a project, or he gives you some like guidance or something like that. That is a very different type of pronouncement that he's going to give you versus if he sent you a strongly worded email telling you that you need to have something done by this deadline, or you need to do this, you need to do that. So obviously in our day-to-day lives, as we interact with other people in various different portions of authority and obedience, there are going to be different degrees of pronouncement. And the same sort of logic applies to the papal magisterium. So really what it takes is it just kind of takes a degree of common sense while you're reading these documents to see what is exactly going on. How is he exactly trying to communicate the truth? And where is he trying to bind us versus where is he actually not trying to bind us? So that's very important right there. So just because something is contained in a papal document, even if it's an encyclical letter, by the way, even if it's an encyclical letter, just because something is contained in a papal document does not mean that it's meant to bind your conscience in that way. Okay. So the classic example is usually argumentation. So even in ex cathedra pronouncements, there is sections of the document, obviously outside of the definition itself. There's sections of the document that are meant to give like the scriptural arguments or the historical arguments, or maybe like a historical overview of the doctrine in the church. Those parts of the document, those are not meant to bind your generally speaking. Okay. I mean, specifically, like, of course, they could phrase it in certain ways. So you can't really give like too general of a rule to where they actually do mean to bind you in this. But generally speaking, as to the normal way in which it's spoken, that's not something which is meant to constitute a doctrinal pronouncement. Okay. So then you also, as another note, remember that the object of assent is often different as well. So sometimes the popes put forward something as a doctrinal pronouncement, which is meant to bind you as that being true. And other times they actually only mean to bind you in the sense of admitting something as safe or not safe, which this is not really something that's done as much anymore. That's more so the style of older documents. So it's not really something that I need to get into. But what's important for me to highlight as a general rule is that what is meant to bind are actually doctrinal pronouncements. So you have to ask, what are the doctrinal pronouncements in a certain document? And distinguishing it from simply matters of background information or argumentation or things like that. Like when you go through a document, what are those matters in which the Pope is treating ex professo? So ex professo basically means what are those matters that the Pope is specifically focusing on, that thesis that he means to instill into your intellect. So that's the doctrinal pronouncement. There are actually documents sometimes that and we'll see a few examples in going through some of the documents of Pope Leo. There's some documents that actually don't have doctrinal pronouncements. So if you have, like a lot of times, like an Angelus message will sometimes basically just be like, oh, this is what the gospel was this Sunday. I hope you guys all have, I'm glad you guys came out to Rome. I'm greeting all you different groups. Like there's not really a doctrinal pronouncement there, right? And we can think of other examples as well. But usually that's only going to be in almost entirely, it's only going to be in usually the broad category of speeches or allocutions, if you want to use that term to describe these. And then also not everything a pope introduces or speaks is magisterial. It's only what he speaks as the Bishop of Rome with the intention of teaching. So thinking of things like TV interviews, social media posts, brief meditations, private theological works, and then private theological answers as well. There's a bunch of different categories that we can put in here. But basically, what you have to remember is that non-magisterial pronouncements can be very easily distinguished from magisterial pronouncements by their placement in the Acta Apostolica Sedes, the AAS. The AAS is basically the official journal if you may, of the Apostolic See. So, to give like a really silly and kind of funny example, a lot of times there are allocutions by the popes that are given to different groups. So, like the Pope, for example, Venerable Pius XII did this a lot. So, he gave an allocution to Italian midwives. He gave an allocution to Italian journalists. An allocution is like a formal speech, specifically. Um, so, there are these different speeches that the Pope can make to individual groups. Now, Pope Francis, he also had a lot of speeches that he gave to individual groups. We can think of the famous speech that he gave to the Italian bishops, where, he talked about getting rid of the faggotry in the seminaries. Now, is Pope Francis's comments about the faggotry in the seminaries, is that magisterial? No. No, it's not magisterial, okay? It's not him speaking as the bishop of Rome for teaching purposes of the church. So what like in reality, and this may be like a weird question, but what in reality distinguishes a private meeting that the Pope has with a group of bishops where he gives a speech, and a meeting that he has with Italian jurists that he gives a speech? Because some of you may be confused by that, or the in the ancient church, there were a lot of homilies that were given by, actually, there have always been a lot of homilies given by the popes. Are these homilies all of a sudden, magisterial pronouncements by the popes? No. So basically, what distinguishes the two is their inclusion in the official acta of the pope. So the pope means to present this publicly and juridically as an act of the Apostolic See in the AAS, juridically and doctrinally. Now, when it comes to the AAS, it's not all, like, I'm not saying, the weird Timothy Gordon position where everything in the AAS is like the deposit of faith. No, there's a lot of stuff in the AAS, but if something doctrinal is included in the AAS, then it's something which is intended as some sort of teaching of the Apostolic See, and not merely of a private teaching of, a group of individuals such as bishops or, whatever it may be. So, broadly speaking, from all of these different distinctions, we can set forward like 4 general categories of different teachings from the Pope. So, first, you have non-magisterial statements. So, as I mentioned, like social media posts, TV interviews, stuff like that. Those are non-magisterial. So, they may actually provide context to what the Pope says. So, for example, Pope Francis, he gave that one interview on 60 Minutes. And he explained a little bit about Fiducia Supplicans and what he meant to teach in Fiducia Supplicans. So while, of course, that TV interview is not something which is magisterial, what the Pope said there is a very efficacious resource to interpret his own intention, right? So second, we have interactions which I call the mostly pastoral ones. So the mostly pastoral ones, when it comes to these, they're, generally speaking, they're not going to really contain that many. If, it's very rare for one of these mostly pastoral statements to contain a unique doctrinal pronouncement. So this is actually what we've seen mostly from Leo so far, is almost to, I don't think there's been a single unique doctrinal pronouncement so far from what Leo has said. Basically, everything that he has said has been a mere repetition of already existing doctrinal pronouncements. So pastoral documents are usually meant to take doctrinal pronouncements that are already within the teaching magisterium of the church and meant to apply them in unique circumstances. So, for example, Leo, he came out with he was actually talking to the interreligious dialogue stuff with, he was talking to some Jews and Muslims and things like that. All he did was just repeat what Nostra Aetate says. That's all he did. He just said, yeah, this is what Nostra Aetate says about you. This is what Nostra Aetate says about you. Yeah, that's awesome. That's what he did. And he explained it in a pastoral context. He applied it in a pastoral context. This is not meant to put forward any sort of new or unique doctrinal pronouncement. So usually those are good for interpreting, the doctrinal pronouncements of the church. It's good for following general moral guidance on how these doctrinal pronouncements ought to apply in this day and age, in this environment, but they're really not meant to introduce anything unique, right? So when it comes to these, they end up being of a very generally, again, generally, because there can be unique circumstances, generally of a low weight. So what I call these just allocutions. Allocutions, technically speaking, is usually reserved now for like a more formal speech, but allocutions can, in a broad sense, just be applied to any sort of speech. This would be like papal homilies, audiences, uh, uh, general catecheses, Angelus and Regina Caeli messages, things like that. And then you have, next to the mostly pastoral, you have the generally doctrinal. I don't even know what to call it, but generally doctrinal. So, generally doctrinal documents could be encyclicals. Encyclicals are the normal ways in which the Pope teach in a doctrinal matter. That's just the normal way in which the Pope communicates his teaching. A lot of times it's going to contain doctrinal pronouncements that are already contained within the teaching magisterium. Sometimes it introduces unique ones. And the big difficulty with encyclicals is going to be able to distinguish between doctrinal pronouncements and then those other aspects that I mentioned of like illustration or argumentation or things like that. Like, what is the essential thesis or theses that are meant to be communicated in this encyclical, right? And then you have general apostolic letters. So general apostolic letters, these are, they kind of just are basically the same as encyclicals. I mean, they cover different topics usually. Like, for some reason, general apostolic letters are usually talking about different people. Like, that's what they like to concern, is different people. But it's still meant to be somehow teaching, and that's really what the important thing is. And then you have apostolic exhortations. So apostolic exhortations, I like to think of them as basically like extended. It like bridges the gap between the mostly pastoral and the doctrinal. These apostolic exhortations are generally meant to just be concrete applications of doctrinal pronouncements that are already contained within the teaching magisterium of the church. So if you thought about it, if like a priest gave a, I don't know, like a 5-hour homily, that's what an apostolic exhortation would be. It's kind of like a really long pastoral document. Obviously, as I mentioned with allocutions, they can contain unique teaching. It does happen, but it's just usually something of a more pastoral bent to it. So you just kind of have to keep that in mind. And then finally, the fourth. So there's non-magisterial, mostly pastoral, again, mostly doctrinal, or I could just call that mostly doctrinal. And then the last one is legislative. So legislative, again, remember, there's usually some sort of doctrinal preface to laws which are given by the church. They don't kind of present it just like they would the Code of Canon Law or anything like that. But this would be apostolic letters issued motu proprio. So Traditionis Custodes is an example of that, you know. And then there's also apostolic constitutions. So apostolic constitutions, they are meant to be like big boy laws, like huge. Those are like very highest, most important legislative documents are apostolic constitutions. Motu proprio is kind of usually much more restricted in what types of laws they change. It's more so meant to deal with a concrete problem that's going on in this circumstance or that circumstance. But yeah, the apostolic constitution is meant to be like, there's an entire apostolic constitution going over the legislation on education, or the legislation on papal conclave law, or the legislation on the Roman Curia, or whatever it may be. So beside this point, I think that's actually. Oh yeah, then another aspect I forgot to bring up is when it comes to like the because I have a feeling that this is going to be very relevant during the papacy of Leo the 14th, as it was with Pope Francis, is that when it comes to when it comes to sorry, I got completely distracted because I looked at the chat. One of you guys distracted me. Oh yeah, when it comes to those non-pronouncement parts of these documents, we can also look at like the concrete circumstances. That's usually what I call it, the concrete circumstances. This is different. This is different than relativizing teaching by an appeal to the concrete circumstances, which is a like liberal modernist move that uh, Venerable Pius XII called out. But concrete circumstances such as the scientific commentary that is given by Pope Francis in Laudato Si. Like Pope Francis is not meant to employ um, his doctrinal province when he talks about facts about climate change taken from natural scientists. Like I could be a perfectly good Catholic in good standing, in good conscience, and disagree with what Pope Francis says about science, right? Or similar matters, we could think about history. We could think about the certain contemporary circumstances in this or that society. So let's say we want to argue that Pope Francis, when he um, discuss the problem of immigration in America, that Pope Francis didn't understand the circumstances well enough. Like somebody could argue that and still hold to the pronouncements on ethical and political moral matters that he brings forward and say, oh well, he got these questions of the temporal sphere. He got those questions wrong, not insofar as obviously they touch his doctrinal authority when he's teaching on matters of morals, but insofar as he might not have understood that these individuals weren't actually valid refugees. Let's say, like that would be a good example. Okay. Besides all of this, so this is a last point. This is the last point. This is the last point, okay? And if you want to read more about this, because allocutions and encyclicals, they both require obsequium religiosum in their doctrinal pronouncements. If you want to read more about this, Monsignor Joseph Fenton, he did two different articles, one on papal encyclicals, one on papal allocutions, arguing from Humani Generis that these both, when containing doctrinal pronouncements, are meant to bring about obsequium religiosum. So if you want to read about that, he talks about that. I linked both of those articles below. I think they're pretty helpful because a lot of times people think like, oh, this is just a pope making a speech. Like, for example, theology of the body. Theology of the body, there are a lot of very significant, unique doctrinal pronouncements in theology of the body that is actually meant to settle certain controversies or to, in some way, bind the consciences of those who are listening to it, because it is a catechesis which is meant for the entire church, right? So theology of the body, that is a very important set of papal allocutions that must be read. Okay, so that's a pretty famous example, but there's a bunch of them that we can think of. But besides all of this, there's also the teaching of dicasteries. And I'm sorry if this whole like first half seems very scattershot, because I want to just go through everything so far, just so you kind of have a grounding for the future. I feel like this is very scattershot, but I promise there's a method to the madness why I'm bringing out all of these. So when it comes to Roman dicasteries, contrary to Loftonian belief, just because a dicastery teaches something does not make it binding on the consciences of Catholics. In its province as, let's say, meant to legislate or given the authority to legislate over religious life, or meant to legislate over Episcopal conferences or something like that. Sure, in that way, in terms of legislation. But when it comes to, generally speaking, outside of the DDF, right, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, there's not a doctrinal province that is given to the dicasteries which is meant to bind our consciences when it comes to their pronouncements. So, like, for example, and the reason I brought up the Loftonian thing is there was a bit of an unfortunate and kind of ridiculous video or stream that Michael Lofton did on the Dicastery for Interreligious Dialogue. They released a document on Buddhism. And I mean, I read the document and I didn't actually have anything wrong with what the document said. I mean, it basically just said, yeah, this is what Nostra Aetate says. Like, awesome, thumbs up. It wasn't like a terrible document. It didn't like contain manifest error or anything like that. But Lofton, he was like presenting it. He was crazy the way that he was presenting this. He seems to insinuate in his hearers. I don't know if he believes this himself, but it definitely, the message came across and insinuated among those listening that Lofton thinks like the pronouncements for the dicastery for interreligious dialogue are meant to have some sort of doctrinal province and is meant to bind the consciences of all Catholics. He was telling people who are having a difficulty with the statement from the dicastery, like, hey, you better, you're gonna go before God one day. Like, you're gonna, guys, like, real, you're gonna go to hell because you had a difficulty with what a non authoritative dicastery statement about Buddhism says. It's so completely ridiculous. But anyways, what we do need to pay attention to is, on the one hand, there could be like an extraordinary instance where the Pope promulgates in what's called in specific form. Pope promulgates in specific form some sort of document from a different dicastery, like he takes it upon himself as providing his own authority and like stamps his own name on that. That can happen. So like technically speaking, we could have that sort of situation, but just some sort of like tacit approval, like the way that Lofton was arguing is there's some sort of tacit approval because the Pope knows about this document. It's like, okay, that doesn't really matter. The Pope knows about a lot of things. Like the Roman congregations know about the local synods of like bishop synods and knows about them and like doesn't interact with them. It doesn't mean that somehow their authority gets raised up to the universal level. It's there's a reason why we have like very clear distinctions about these things in our historical teaching on magisteriology. But regularly speaking, the only congregation, it used to also be there used to be the Pontifical Biblical Commission, which used to have this authority as well. But now it's just the DDF, generally speaking. Okay, like there could be extraordinary circumstances, but generally speaking, habitually speaking, it's only the DDF. Okay, so when the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith says something, it is meant to bind your conscience, right? Okay, so just wanted to clarify that point because I saw some weirdness going on when it came to specifically the statement from the dicastery for interreligious dialogue. It was quite strange. But anyways, let's actually get into, now that I've went through all of the general categories, let's get into all of the specific documents. So when it comes to these specific documents, I went through every single one of them, and basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a brief summary of like the interesting points in it, because not that there aren't a lot of interesting things in there. Like he has a homily, let's say, on the parable of the sower. No, he has a homily on the parable of the sower. Like, sure, go ahead, read that. But I mean, a lot of times he's just giving reflections on the parable itself. It's like there's not really much commentary I can give on a homily like that, right? So with things like that, obviously, I'm just going to more or less report to the fact that he had this document. And if you want to read it, like you're really interested in reflecting on the parable of the sower and would like to hear what Pope Leo has to say, or is like encouragement of world missions or something like that, if you're really interested in reading about that, I will tell you what date that document happened, and you can go and you can find it and you can read it. But there's really not much commentary that I can actually give on things like that. So starting with the beginning, I'll answer questions at the end if there are any questions. But starting at the beginning, May 8th, that was the first day in which he became Pope. He had his Urbi et Orbi blessing, so his blessing to the city and to the world, right? So this blessing, it was general. Everyone already saw it. He called for peace. He called for unity. He had that awesome quote where he said, "I'm an Augustinian, a son of St. Augustine." That's what happened then. I don't really need to go into any sort of detail about that. If you want to read it, you can read it. But it was just general overtures of peace and general overtures of unity. And this is going to be very important throughout the different addresses that he gives, because peace and unity are going to be two things that he's going to hammer on all the time. And what's very important is that a lot of these documents are going to mutually highlight or mutually, not really highlight, but mutually explain one another. So there are multiple, across multiple different addresses, Pope Leo talked about peace and unity and how peace and unity happen. If you read some of these documents in isolation, like you read the documents he says about peace and unity in, I can't remember off the top of my head, but probably the one when he had the one on interreligious dialogue with all the religious leaders of the world. If you read that, you may say, oh, well, actually, his calling for peace and unity here, that's completely detached from the truth. It's completely detached from the preaching of the gospel. It's completely detached from inclusion in the mystical body of Christ by conversion to the Catholic faith. Like, if you just read those in isolations, you may think that. But actually, he had an allocution like the day before where he talked about the need for conversion, the need for unity in the mystical body of Christ, the need for the presentation of truth. We cannot have this weird sort of subjectivism. We actually need to speak on terms of objective principles in order to bring about this peace and unity. So it's very important that actually, when you're going over these different documents, you're always keeping in mind what other documents are saying. So if you read something which is very confusing in one document or tends towards something in one document, you can't read it in isolation of all of his other statements. Like, that would just be completely ridiculous. So that's why drawing out these normal threads of documents covering the same topics is so useful. And you can actually get a little bit more of a systematic understanding of what he's saying versus if you were just reading like one or two snippets. I think another example that gets brought up is the recent accusations that there were towards Pope Leo that he was denying papal supremacy because of what he said about the the fraternity and brotherhood that ought to happen, and the fact that the Pope is not like an autocrat. The Pope is actually meant to be a servant. He's meant to serve his fellow Catholics. He's meant to be that one who brings everyone towards unity and not like lord his power over others. Like, if you read that in isolation and you've lost a few brain cells, like, you may think that that is actually the Pope saying, oh, I'm not the supreme chief shepherd of the entire church. Like, I actually don't think that. I actually don't think that the papacy is necessary. Like, you may think that he's saying stuff like that. But if you read it in context of the statements that he made in his doctoral dissertation, which is now available on Isidore.co, go to Isidore.co, look up Prevost. You can read his doctoral dissertation. The first introductory section is most helpful for this topic. You can read about what he says about, the way in which authority happens when he was head of the dicastery for bishops. You can read these different you can read these different documents and understand, like, that's not at all what he was saying, especially because if you consistently read through his addresses, you see that he's mentioning all the time the Petrine ministry. And this is actually one of the more important, and this is just because the papal conclave just happened, but one of his more important focuses throughout his early homilies was talking about the Petrine ministry, was talking about the biblical foundations for it, was talking about how he views his role. He is the head of the church, and as the head of the church, bringing others into union with Christ's body, that is how he unites people. So that's also ties in with his goal for interreligious dialogue, evangelism, and things like that, is he's actually meant to unify people by bringing them closer to the mystical body of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to his, I want to get into his first homily. So his first homily was on May 9th. This was his homily at Mass with the cardinals. And he spoke about a few different things which we're going to see are very common in the teaching of Leo. He spoke on the Petrine ministry. We've already spoken about that. He spoke on the resurrection. This kind of also has to do with the fact that it was an Easter season. He spoke about the primacy of grace, and then he spoke against modern errors about Christ. If you wanted to read like one thing from Pope Leo, let's say you were just like, okay, give me the one thing I read from Pope Leo that's going to highlight or best offer a compendium of a lot of his concerns that he has expressed over and over again so far, it would be his May 9th homily. It's actually a very good homily, intrinsically speaking. He says, and I got a quote from it that I thought was really good. Peter, in his response, understands both of these things, the gift of God and the path to follow, to order to allow himself to be changed by that gift. They are two inseparable aspects of salvation entrusted to the church to be proclaimed for the good of the human race. Indeed, they are entrusted to us who were chosen by him before we were formed in our mother's wombs. Reborn in the waters of baptism and surpassing our limitations, and with no merit of our own, brought here and sent forth from here, so that the gospel might be proclaimed to every creature. And this sets forward a lot of what he's going to say throughout his different homilies. He loves to focus on the primacy of grace, our absence of merit, the fact that our free choice is brought about through some sort of antecedent act on the part of God, et cetera, et cetera. He's very grace focused, which is just absolutely awesome. And this is something that he actually connects in with. He connects this in with the interreligious dialogue and bringing together unity and all of these things. This has to be something which is done with a view to supernatural grace. This cannot be something which is merely done through natural methods, right? So the next day on May 10th, he had a meeting with the College of Cardinals. He talked a little bit more about the Petrine ministry. He talked about ecclesiology, just like he had spoken about the day before. He spoke about the direction of the church, and he highlighted a few different distinct ends that he thought the church ought to be taken towards in light of the pronouncements of Pope Francis and in light of the pronouncements of the Second Vatican Council. And a lot of these are very good, and we see them concretely being brought forward already in his magisterium. So I just wanted to read that section in particular with his meeting with the College of Cardinals. He said, quote, "In this regard, I would like us to renew together today our complete commitment to the path that the Universal Church has now followed for decades in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. Pope Francis masterfully and concretely set it forth in the Apostolic Constitution on Evangelii Gaudium. Sorry, I don't know why I tripped over that. From which I would like to highlight several fundamental points. The return to the primacy of Christ in proclamation, very important. That one right there, the primacy of the Christ in proclamation. The missionary conversion of the entire Christian community. This one as well, he's brought this up multiple different points. The fact that the entirety of the baptized are in Catholic action, supposed to be missionaries bringing forth the teaching of the gospel. The growth in collegiality and synodality, something he's brought up multiple times as well. Attention to the sensus fidei, especially in its most authentic and inclusive form, such as popular piety. Loving care for the least and the rejected. Courageous and trusting dialogue with the contemporary world and its various components and realities. So all of those points we've concretely seen so far in the teaching of Pope Leo. So that's a pretty important guideline to the type of things he's going to talk about. And then beyond that, he also spoke on the choice of his name as Pope Leo. He says, "Sensing myself called to continue in this same path, I chose to take the name Leo XIV. There are different reasons for this, but mainly because Pope Leo XIII, in his historic encyclical Rerum Novarum, addressed the social questions in the context of the first great industrial revolution. In our day, the church offers to everyone the treasury of her social teaching in response to another industrial revolution and to developments in the field of artificial intelligence, and that pose new challenges for the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor." So in this point, the connection with Pope Leo XIII is so important. I don't think a lot of you guys realize. I've been reading a lot over the past 2 weeks now. Although before that, I've obviously read about his life. I've been reading a lot about the specific charism that Leo XIII brought to the throne of St. Peter, because there is a very distinct way in which Leo XIII and Leo XIV acted in relation to the teaching of the church, right? There's very distinct ways. So when it came to Blessed Pius IX, Blessed Pius IX was very inward turning, right? Pius IX, he had lost the papal states. He was very much the guy who set his back to the world because the world had set its back to him. Not in a negative way. He did that as a courageous stand for the autonomy and independence of the church. So that was extremely important. So he didn't do it in that sense, but he definitely had a lot less interaction with political authorities. On the other hand, Leo the 13th, his idea of political theology was completely his idea of methodology, which flows from political theology, which is a different thing. Methodology is different than like the doctrinal principles, which Leo himself actually highlights. Leo the 14th, that is. So his methodology was very different. What he wanted to do is he actually saw the teaching, especially the social teaching of the church, as somehow solving a lot of the problems that that the world was having. So he wanted to be much more involved. So he wanted to have a great deal of involvement when it came to the modern world. So he actually like had frequent contact with political authorities. He fought against them sometimes, but he wanted to leaven. He wanted to leaven a little bit when he had those interactions, and he was very big on that sort of form of Catholic action. And it's this way in particular, actually, when you read what Leo the 14th has been saying about interreligious dialogue, what he's been saying about especially to his statement to the diplomatic corps, a lot of those statements, he himself has very much the same idea as Leo the 13th. He thinks that basically what you have in Catholic social teaching is you have an ability to leaven the entirety of society. You basically have the ability to bring forward those objective principles, and you're able to bring them to bear on practical methods, right? That's what you're able to do. So he sees the social teaching of the church as something which can positively be presented even outside the scope of Christendom and into many different areas as leavening the whole lump. Like this is the idea that Leo the 13th had. This is the idea that Leo the 14th is following quite closely. If that made sense. I don't know if I explained myself exactly very clear. But yes, the idea of a treasury of social teaching. The idea of a treasury of social teaching. And in two pronouncements in particular, he goes into a little bit more detail on this, and they need to be read in light of one another, which I'm obviously going to do later. But yes, that is very important, the choosing of his name. Give me 1 second. Okay, I'm back now. So that was May 10th. So May 11th was his Regina Caeli prayer. Almost if you want a good example of what I mentioned earlier, like teachings or a document which is devoid of doctrinal pronouncements, it would basically be the May 11th Regina Caeli prayer. He kind of gave some like current event statements, and he mentioned some things about the gospel for the week and what the gospel was and like world vocations, but really there wasn't doctrinal pronouncements uniquely or really at all set forward in that in the prayer of that day. He had a homily the same day. Basically, he repeated what he said on world vocations. He had a narration of the gospel. I believe it was the gospel of the sower. So for May 11th, that's a good example of what I mentioned earlier. So May 12th, he had his meeting with media representatives. He spoke on modern media. He spoke on war. Those are pretty normal things which Leo has spoken on, especially the stuff on war. And then May 13th, he had an audience with the gathered Eastern clerics for the Jubilee of Eastern Catholics. So he spoke on Eastern Christianity. He spoke on war. He spoke on a lot of things like that. But there are some interesting points if you're interested in Eastern Catholicism and you're interested in the Eastern tradition. You want to read on them. He brings up some very interesting points, especially on the ways in which Eastern Catholicism could be a antidote to a lot of the at least could be an antidote in the sense of not everyone becoming Eastern Catholic, but in the sense of the Eastern Catholic emphases being brought up anew in the Latin tradition. Obviously, we have our own authentic tradition of these, but sort of as matters of emphasis. So this is what he said in particular about this. There's a lot of people want to look at the liturgy stuff, but there's actually more than that. He says, and this is from May 13th, the church needs you. The contribution that the Christian East can offer us today is immense. We have great need to recover the sense of mystery that remains alive in your liturgies that engage the human person in his or her entirety, that sing of the beauty of salvation and evoke a sense of wonder at how God's majesty embraces our human frailty. It is likewise important to rediscover, especially in the Christian West, a sense of the primacy of God. So the primacy of God, the importance of mystagogy, right there, and the values so typical of Eastern spirituality: constant intercession, penance, fasting, and weeping for one's own sins and for those of all humanity. It is vital, and this part is actually the most interesting to me. It is vital then that you preserve your traditions without attenuating them for the sake perhaps of practicality or convenience, lest they be corrupted by the mentality of consumerism and utilitarianism. So basically this idea of throwing away a lot of your traditions because, people need to get to Sunday brunch. So you got to have your mass finish in an hour, or else it's not going to be it's not going to be convenient for a lot of people. That's the sort of idea that's going on there. But a lot of those interesting focuses, things like penance and fasting, and then also things like the focus on mystagogy. These are all extremely, extremely important. And then he also spoke on the right of a people to a homeland. So this is something that Francis had covered a lot. And this is something that is actually one of the, I think, most underrated, important political principles that Pope Francis brings forward, that a lot of like right wingers, unfortunately, they don't realize is actually very supportive of some of their ideologies. So he says, specifically speaking on Middle Eastern Christians, I thank God for those Christians, Eastern and Latin alike, who above all in the Middle East preserve and remain in their homelands, resisting the temptation to abandon them. Christians must be given the opportunity, and not just in words, to remain in their native lands with all the rights needed for a secure existence. Please let us strive for this. So this actually touches on two very important points. One is the fact that the circumstances which brought about mass migration, the circumstances that brought about mass migration was a violation of rights. Like it was a bad situation. Two, that we ought to strive to what the magisterium calls voluntary repatriation. So voluntary repatriation means sending people back home. So you have people who had to move outside of their historic homelands into the West for whatever reason of war, blah, 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 blah. It's actually what the church calls us to do is the church calls us to fix the situation in their homeland so we can send them back. This is called voluntary repatriation. So repatriation is, and by the voluntary part of it, voluntary basically means that you're not sending somebody into a situation that they have valid reasons not to want to go back to. So like if you were going to try to send somebody back into an active war zone, for example, that obviously would be pretty bad. But the second point is that voluntary repatriation is something which is the end of migration. The end of migration is to send them back. It's not to just keep them here. We need to just stop toppling their government so we can send them back. That's the important point right here. And then third, beside the fact that what caused mass migration was evil, and also the situation of repatriation, third is going to be the right of a people to a homeland. So this is not simply the right of different individuals, but actually the right of a people for a homeland, the right of a group for a homeland. So you cannot strip a group from their homeland. That is evil. That is the reason why we oppose so strongly the Zionist entity, which is attempting to strip the homeland of the Palestinian people, because they have a right by natural law, the Palestinian people, to their native homeland and to not be molested in their native homeland and to be able to remain there secure in their native homeland. And Israel is violating that right for the Palestinian people. So that's part of the reason. But this doesn't only apply, to be a little bit flippant here, this doesn't only apply to brown people. there isn't something special about the fact that you're not white to where you get a homeland, and then if you're white, you don't get a homeland. But this same sort of reasoning, the same sort of logic, is actually brought forward by many very high-ranking clerics. Cardinal Ick, for example, Cardinal Erdu has brought this up. High-ranking clerics, some of the more conservative bent, but these same principles apply to the rights of white people. The rights to Europeans to be unmolested in their homelands. You can't just take these people and destroy their homelands and make it so they're not secure in their homelands. So white people also have a right to a secure existence in their native lands. So that's something that's awesome that Leo XIV highlighted. But, this isn't something that only Leo XIV highlighted. This is something that was highlighted very strongly by Pope Francis. Pope Francis talked about this all the time. So that's very important. I just wanted to bring up that aspect because a lot of times people forget that that's something which is essential. Okay, so moving past the audience for the Jubilee of Eastern Catholics, on May 15th, the audience with the Brothers of the Christian Schools, he talked about education in general, continuing the mission of the church. He talked about Catholic action flowing from one's baptismal charisms, one baptismal munus, he talked about that. That's kind of just normal Vatican II stuff. He's kind of just repeating what has been contained previously. But yes, it's very important. Catholic action is a requirement that flows forth from what is given to us in baptism, right? So, that's just general stuff. But he also mentions other things as well in other audiences which connect with this, of his idea of and he mentioned this when it came to the Eastern Catholics as well, is that we need to focus on that sort of general catechesis and inclusion of all people in social action for bringing a Catholic action, for bringing about, the ends of the Catholic Church and things. So yeah, interesting, whatever. So May 16th, and this is May 16th and May 17th. These two, if you want to understand, you have to read these two together, right? You have to read these two together. So May 16th and May 17th. May 16th is to the Diplomatic Corps, and May 17th is the audience with the members of the Centesimus Annus Pro Pontifice Foundation. So those are the two audiences, but you have to read these together. And these really go into how he views the role of the church when it comes to Catholic action. So the role of the church when it comes to Catholic action, especially the role of the Roman pontiff himself when it comes to Catholic action. So on the 16th, it's more concerned with, how Leo XIV and how the church engages in evangelistic mission by having a diplomatic corps. Like, that's something which is unique to the Roman Catholic Church, is we actually have a diplomatic corps. We actually have diplomatic connections with other nations. Like, we have a Vatican Secretary of State. We're involved in world events. Why do you think Leo XIV wants to be so involved in the war between Ukraine and Russia, the war in Israel, in Palestine, in Gaza? Why do you think he's so interested in these things? He thinks he's so interested in these things because he does see this as part of the evangelical mission of the church. This is something which was especially highlighted under Leo XIII. Leo XIII was tasked in many ways, and he saw that as one of his highest honors as Pope, for Leo XIII to step into different brother wars, for lack of a better term, which were happening throughout Europe. Like, he saw that as one of his greatest honors. So Leo XIV, in his statement to the Diplomatic Corps, he's like, yeah, we need to bring forward peace, justice, and truth. Peace, justice, and truth. And these are various different ends that the church is as a sanctifying presence in the world. He's a sanctifying presence in the world. So, for example, stopping a war between two nations is going to somehow dispose towards the hearing of the gospel. I'll explain it, kind of give a summary of what he said when he talked about peace in particular. But basically, there needs to be, in order for the preaching of the gospel, a certain set of concrete circumstances that are well disposed towards such preaching. And a lot of people may not recognize this because they're not really involved in this type of work. But like if you know of anybody who does any sort of missionary work, the diplomatic mission of the church and the relations between the church and different states is actually very important for missionary work. So when we, let's say, have people sent to a certain, I don't know, like Morocco or something, the fact that the Pope has a good relationship with the King of Morocco and the fact that they have some sort of agreement made amongst themselves actually makes the celebration of the sacraments in that country possible. It actually makes missions in that country possible. That would otherwise be completely impossible. So when the Pope is presenting, and you see this in earlier treatises, I could go into detail about this. I wrote like a bunch of notes about this. But when you go into the earlier teaching of the church, there is in Manuals of Catholic Action, it discusses various different situations in which the church could find herself in. So the church doesn't always go into every single country demanding the ideal. Like the ideal is that every country in the world would be a confessional state. You know, that's not something that was somehow abrogated by Vatican II. You can read the CDF response to Lefebvre. That's not something that is abrogated by Vatican II. Rather, something that does happen in the modern world, and has happened for a long time, is just because we recognize that, sure, ideally speaking, confessional states are awesome, we do see that the church is attempting to make the best of the situation that it actually has in various different countries. So it would be stupid if we went into, Saudi Arabia and said, we need to make this country a Catholic confessional state. Rather, what we need to do is we need to go into that country and advocate for, religious freedom in that country. Advocate for the circumstances where the church could work within the country the best way it can. So, classically speaking, Manuals of Catholic Action, Ottaviani goes over this, Grenier goes over this, Usse goes over this. There's a lot of authors that go over this, but generally speaking, in the traditional way, like you look at the different circumstances that a country is in. Gary Lagrange also goes over this, by the way. I don't know why I just thought of that. And then you tailor your message to that country. So for a place like Saudi Arabia, you're not going to be advocating for a confessional state, right? But in a place, like a failing confessional state, a state where there's actually going to be separation of church and state, it's a failing confessional state, you advocate for the non-secularization of the proper, like not seizing the properties of the church, allowing clerics not to have to be conscripted into military service. There's a lot of different ways in which the church speaks to concrete missions. So you have to keep this in mind when you're reading what he says about peace and the end of peace. What he's saying, and you can clearly read this from the document in his message to the diplomatic corps, is he wants to set forward the circumstances in which, in a lot of these countries, the gospel can best be preached. So this is why when he's talking about peace, that is what he's talking about. And this is something which is very frequent in the pronouncements of the popes far before Vatican II. This isn't like a Vatican II novelty. Okay, so I hope that made sense, because I think that connection is super important. So I would suggest that you guys read that for yourselves if you're super interested in this. He talks about justice as well is an important aspect of this. Is we just have a general humanitarian concern that things be done justly. But the third point is very, very important, because a lot of people were trying to, and I'm going to actually read this. A lot of people were trying to misconstrue what he said about something. The third point is truth. So when he talks about specifically what we are doing in Catholic Action, there's two aspects to this. There's going to be the aspect of principle, right? There's going to be the aspect of the principle, the ideal. This isn't the condemned error, by the way. There's a certain condemned error of what are called the moderate liberals, where they say that the preaching of the ideal sort of situation of a church as a confessional state and the demands that the gospel makes on the relationship between the church and the state, that is something that you only teach in the schools, and it's not something that you teach within the halls of power. It's a completely different statement than them. But basically, what he's saying is that we have matters of principle, right? We have matters of principle, the principles of Catholic action about, let's say, abolishing abortion. And then we actually have the concrete circumstances that we find ourselves in. So, in the concrete circumstances which we find ourselves in, we believe that abortion is evil and it's a crime. How are we going to work within this society in which we are found in here and now for actually bringing about the elimination of abortion? Those are the two questions. So, one of those is completely immutable. One of those has nothing to do with what day or age that we find ourselves in, because abortion is always wrong and it's always deserving of criminal punishment, right? But the other one actually does require creative solutions. It requires skilled diplomats. It requires skilled political thinkers for being able to understand the ways in which we are going to work in the society in which we find ourselves in for carrying out the ends of peace and justice, which he had just mentioned in the first two ends. But this mention of truth is very important. He says the third word is truth. Truly peaceful relationships cannot be built also within the international community apart from truth, where words take on ambiguous and ambivalent connotations, and the virtual world, with its alleged perception of reality, takes over unchecked. It is difficult to build authentic relationships, since the objective and real premises of communication are lacking. For her part, the Church can never be exempted from speaking the truth about humanity and the world, resorting whenever necessary to blunt language that may initially create misunderstanding. Yet truth can never be separated from charity, which always has at its root a concern for the life and well-being of every man and woman. Furthermore, from the Christian perspective, truth is not the affirmation of abstract and disembodied principles, but an encounter with the person of Christ himself, alive in the midst of the community of believers. Truth then does not create division, but rather enables us to confront all the more resolutely the challenges of our time, such as migration, the ethical use of artificial intelligence, and the protection of our beloved planet Earth. These are challenges that require commitment and cooperation on the part of all, since no one can think of facing them alone. So what is very, very important here is that for Leo XIV, he has a specific and unique concern when it comes to Catholic action with retaining those principles as an end of evangelism. Kind of what I mentioned before. And reading alongside this, you need to go into the audience of the next day, which I'm going to bring up right now. The next day, he says a lot more important things, which explain exactly what he meant about the relationship between the certain and immutable principles of truth and the type of solutions that one may come up with to overcome the unique challenges and problems of today. So, right here. Okay. He says this doctrine, so he's talking about Catholic social teaching. This doctrine helps us to realize that more important than our problems or eventual solutions is the way we approach them, guided by, and these are what's important, guided by criteria of discernment. So this is going to be prudence, right? So in order to overcome and take care of different challenges in Catholic actions, we need to have the virtue of prudence, which is able to discern the situation and the possible solutions to it, right? Sound ethical principles. So obviously this isn't a matter of, let's say we are, trying to overcome the legalization of abortion, right? If we are overcoming the legalization of abortion, first we need to have prudence. So we need to be able to understand how we even, the circumstances in which we're in to understand even how we overcome that in the first place. Second, we need to have sound ethical principles. So we actually need to understand, that abortion is wrong. Like we can't just overturn this. Like Catholic social teaching may have a certain degree of mutability in the different methods it uses, because these methods need to adapt themselves to every single place that the church finds itself in. But it always needs to keep and hold true to those sound ethical principles. And the third one's very interesting. and openness to God's grace. So openness to God's grace. So this is when it comes to Catholic action and when it comes to the solutions that we come up with, this is not merely a natural action. This is actually something which flows forth from sanctifying grace. Like sanctifying grace is that which empowers Catholic action. It's not something which is simply in the realm of it's not something which is merely in the realm of like natural political action. You have the opportunity to show that the church's social doctrine, with its specific anthropological approach, seeks to encourage genuine engagement with social issues. So, again, this is a very major portion of what Leo XIII did. It does not claim to possess a monopoly on truth, either in its analysis of problems or the proposal of concrete solutions. This is going to be in this part of the criteria of discernment, or even, we obviously have a share of ethical principles as well. Where social questions are concerned, knowing how best to approach them is more important than providing immediate responses to why things happen or how to deal with them. The aim is to learn how to confront problems, for these are always difficult since every generation is new and faces new challenges, dreams, and questions. So right here, he's talking about the solution to concrete problems which are in front of us right now. Not a lot of people were like interpreting this as him. It's pretty obvious if you like actually just read it line by line. A lot of people were just trying to interpret this as somehow him talking about, like a progress in terms of like every single generation changes like the substantive doctrinal teachings which lie at the foundation of Catholic action. Like that's just completely ridiculous. He's obviously talking about solutions to concrete problems that are going to be different in every generation. Like we now have to deal with IVF, or we now have to deal with AI, or we have to deal with the new industrial revolution, or whatever it may be. This is a fundamental aspect of our attempt to build a culture of encounter through dialogue and social friendship. For many of our contemporaries, the word dialogue and doctrine can seem incompatible. Perhaps when we hear the word doctrine, we tend to think of a set of ideas belonging to a religion. The word itself makes us feel less disposed to reflect, call things into question, or seek new alternatives. In the case of the Church's social doctrine, we need to make it clear that the word doctrine has another more positive meaning, without which dialogue itself would be meaningless. So it has a second meaning. Doctrine can mean a synonym of science, discipline, and knowledge. Understood in this way, doctrine appears as the product of research. So right here, he's talking about all of those solutions that we come up with to individual problems, which obviously the solutions to individual problems are going to change depending on the situations in which each individual is going to find themselves in, right? That's pretty obvious. And hence of hypotheses, discussions, progress, and setbacks, all aimed at conveying a reliable, organized, and systematic body of knowledge about a given issue. Consequently, a doctrine is not the same as an opinion, but is rather a common collective or even multidisciplinary pursuit of truth. Indoctrination, so notice it's in this context that he talked about indoctrination. I also saw a bunch of people complaining about this. This is actually connecting with what he says about the universal obligation for all believers to engage in social action, like Catholic action, because he believes that there needs to be a sort of building of the habit of reasoning on these points, like an actual habit of Catholic social doctrine, where individuals are able to come to understand the connection between all of the different theses of Catholic social teaching, so they're able to apply these concretely in whatever circumstances they find themselves in, under the discretion of prudence. So this is what he means by that. Indoctrination is immoral. It stifles critical judgment and undermines the sacred freedom of respect for conscience. And by the way, as a sort of like pre-conciliar, pre-modern, if you may, example of this, you can look at the discussions under the pontificate of Leo XIII again, and of the popes in the early 20th century over the idea of like Catholic parties in different countries. There was a huge problem with this, actually, of far too one-sided approaches of Catholic action, to where there was like basically like a uniparty within Catholic countries, to where if you were a Catholic, you were expected to be part of this political party, and that approach definitely was not favored. So it's talking about that sort of thing. It stifles critical judgment, undermines the sacred freedom of respect for conscience, even if erroneous. It resists new notions and rejects movement, change, or the evolution of ideas in the face of new problems. So, if you were to, for example, start a Catholic party, and this Catholic party was seen as like the only Catholic party for the entire country, and whatever solutions they come up with to the abortion problem as seen as like the only Catholic solution for the entirety of the country. You guys agree on matters of principle, obviously, that abortion is wrong, but their specific approach to how they want to further legislation is viewed as the only way of going about it. That would be problematic. Doctrine, on the other hand, as a serious, serene, and rigorous discourse, aims to teach us primarily how to approach problems, and even more importantly, how to approach people. It also helps us to make prudential judgments when confronted with challenges. Serious, rigor, and serenity are what we learn from every doctrine, including the church's social doctrine. And he keeps going on and on and on about this, and a few more helpful points as well. And really, when it comes to the rest of, I'm getting a little bit. I might have to rush through a little bit the last few, but I just wanted to highlight that connection between what he said on May 16th and 17th. I think that lays out a pretty robust and systematic account that he has of his view of Catholic action, which I found to be very interesting. So on May 18th, that was his homily at Eucharistic celebration. He went over like a call for unity, call for missionary zeal, Petrine ministry, talked about Pope Francis' death in the conclave, things like that. May 18th, his Regina Caeli prayer didn't really have much doctrinal content. May 19th, he had an audience with representatives of other churches, ecclesial communities, and other religions. And he basically just talked more about interreligious dialogue and the church's goal in interreligious dialogue as a preparation for evangelism. And he kind of just repeated Nostra Aetate there, you know. And May 20, oh yeah, and in particular, there's actually a degree of, oh wait, no. That's later. Yeah, that was on May 19th. May 20th, he had a homily on the Epistle of St. Paul to the Romans, which was really cool. He talked about grace and justification. He talked about the the Pauline aspects of the charism of the papacy very briefly, which is not something you usually get talked about outside of niche theological circles. And yeah, I thought that was really cool to talk about the Pauline aspect of the papal charism. May 21st, Parable of the Sower. His general audience was on the Parable of the Sower. I think I actually mistakenly said the other one was on the Parable of the Sower, but no, it's the May 21st one. And the May 22nd one offers another key to understanding what he says about unity. So May 22nd is going to be, if you were like to read some of these documents and understand as a hermeneutic for understanding what he thinks about social questions, what he thinks about interreligious dialogue, what he thinks about unity and what unity needs to consist of, I would suggest the audiences on the May 16th to the Diplomatic Corps, 17th to the Foundation, and then the 22nd, which was yesterday, on the General Assembly of the Pontifical Mission Societies. So this one is very important. It urges evangelism amongst all the baptized, which connects back to what he said about the charism of teaching when it came to the Brothers of the Christian Schools, and then also connects into what he said about indoctrination and why we cannot do indoctrination and a few other points that he brings up. But the urgency of evangelism among all the baptized, all people need to be taught this. And then also he brings very clearly into light during this audience what exactly he means by unity and how we bring about unity. So when it comes to how we bring about unity, because he talks about unity all the time, like unity between, let's say, us and Easterners, or us and Protestants, or us and people who are non-Christians. A lot of people may view this unity in like an indifferentist way. So we may understand it as him saying like, oh, we need to break down the barriers and we just need to affirm less things and not actually think about all those things we disagree with. That's how a lot of people may understand the call for unity. but actually he's quite clear. He's quite clear, and made statements in line with this before he was pope. But yesterday, in the audience yesterday, he made it very clear that when he's talking about unity, he means unity that is brought about by preaching the gospel and bringing people into the body of Christ. So bringing people into the church. That's ultimately where he finds unity. He serves unity through evangelism. So there's a certain way in which interreligious dialogue is able to bring about that peace wherein evangelism can thrive. So what he's talking about is he wants to bring people into the Catholic Church in order to bring about this unity and let them retain those non evil aspects of their backgrounds. Whatever goods that they have, they're able to retain. Like for example, the Anglican ordinariate or something like that. Able to bring in those good aspects from their background. But really, the only unity that's able to happen is through the preaching of the gospel and then bringing people into the church under Peter. Those are the only ways in which unity is able to be achieved. So I was very happy to read that and to see that he explicitly is clarifying on this point what his goals are. But wow, it's been an hour and a half. I've been yapping a lot. So I'm going to answer a few questions. I'm sorry if it wasn't clear at all. I felt like I was not the most clear at certain points, but I said I was going to answer questions because I told you earlier. Any thoughts on the problematic St. Gallen bishop that was appointed? I don't know what to make of it. I already said earlier that I don't know about any of this stuff, and I'm not commenting on curial or episcopal appointments. I said that at the beginning that I'm commenting on a curial or episcopal appointments. I don't know about any of that stuff, so I can't really tell you anything about it. Pope St. Leo the 13th, pray for us. We need to have the cultus of Leo the 13th. We need to put forward his cause. Books on if the Pope can be deposed. Books? I don't think there's really an entire book that I can think of, but you can read if you want to read on papal deposition, John of St. Thomas on the deposition of the Pope. You can read that if you want. He goes over the various different opinions, then he offers an opinion of his own, but it's really in the realm of opinion. Why would I read it myself when I have Professor Michael Lofton who can interpret it for me? So true. McChicken Money, thank you. Will Pope Leo the 14th make you a lay cardinal? Almost entirely not. There's almost 1,000% chance that won't happen. In celebration of your work, thank you for the huge super chat, Alex. Congrats and keep up the good work. Jesuits can never be number one. And out of love for the Holy Father, Alex. And also a reminder for everyone, give a review for the book. Review for the book for Bill of Art. Bizlarping vindicated. Why do you always do these streams at the same time with the Byzantine liturgy? Because I want to stop people from going to the Byzantine liturgy. Oh, man. Okay, I mean, I don't know about any of the appointments of whoever to whatever diocese. I'm just reading the teachings of the Pope. Did Pope say the church cannot solve every social problem? And sorry if I missed that part. And what did he really mean? What do you mean that the church cannot solve every social problem? I don't know what specific quote you're talking about. I just reread through all of the documents earlier today, and I don't remember anything where he mentioned that the church cannot solve every social problem. He's very clear about the fact that the solution to our social problems is the church. That's what he thinks. He thinks that like we are the ones who are able to bring about the solution to all of the social problems. And like we need to take the initiative for it. It's kind of like the main line running through his entire thought. Okay, St. Gallen had in this case a right to elect a bishop. They've had it for over a century. The diocese has a long history of being a problematic. It is otherwise not important. Oh, so St. Gallen elected a bishop and the bishop sucked? Is that the story? I don't know what the story is. Yup, I loved Dr. Craig's review of the book. Yes, William Lane Craig reviewed the brief refutation of middle knowledge, which means that you should buy it. Okay, no one has a right to appoint a bishop who will lead people astray. This is a call. Okay, he's okay. Why do you have to be so dull? Obviously, what River is saying is River is not saying that Leo the 14th should be appointing a bishop who can lead people astray. He's just saying that he's just confirming an appointment that's given from others. He's saying basically that it's not that the Pope Leo thought that this guy was a great choice for a bishop and then uniquely chose this guy for a bishop. That's what he's saying. James White reviewed it, did he? Yeah, the St. Gallen bishop is apparently pro female ordination, pro LGBT, pro contraception, etc. Yeah, that sucks, and he should be excommunicated. But the point that River was making is that it's not like Pope Leo uniquely chose this guy because he thought he'd be a great bishop. He's just confirming an appointment that's made by somebody else. Which, personally speaking, if I was, in charge of everything, I would just not confirm the appointment and take the right away because they abuse their right to do something stupid. But, I'm not in charge, so what do I know? Anyways, I've been going for a very long time. I hope you guys appreciate this. Next time there'll be a lot less of the material that has to be gone over beforehand, of the authority of allocutions and encyclicals, the different type of documents and stuff like that. So it should be a lot more fluid. Apologies if this was not fluid, but I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And as always, God bless.